Who was Orson S. Murray? A combination of Ben Franklin with his love for science, Thoreau with his love for nature, Karl Marx with his hope for socialism, and a little bit of Elizabeth Cady Stanton with his advocacy for women's rights. Murray began life in Orwell, Vermont, near Lake Champlain. His uncle Eber was one of its first settlers and a founder of its Baptist church. It was a prosperous farming community, and he worked on farms up through his late 20s. He grew up during the religious fervor of the Second Great Awakening, and perhaps it was the spirit of the times that caused him to want to reform the world. This was the era of circuit riders preaching the message that it was time to make everything right with God and never rest until every form of iniquity be driven from the earth. Foremost among them was Lorenzo Dow, who visited Orwell several times from 1815 to 1818 when Murray was a boy. In 1827, Murray married Catherine Higgins and had their first of 9 children, Carlos, in 1828. In 1831, he received his ministerial license. However, he rarely acted as a minister, and instead, he began to write articles to preach his gospel, his first dealing with temperance. But after reading The Liberator and Garrison's pamphlet, Thoughts on Colonization, he became inspired with the fervor to end slavery. In 1833, he was hired as a lecturer by Garrison's New England Anti-Slavery Society. Meanwhile, the fervor of the period led some to believe a great religious event was about to occur. William Miller, a veteran of the War of 1812, and postmaster of his farming community of Lowhampton, New York, 15 miles south of Orwell, and devout member of the Baptist Church, had memorized the Bible, and his study led him to conclude that the second coming of Christ was imminent. On November 13th, 1833, what is still believed to be the greatest meteor shower in recorded history occurred. To Miller, it was a sign. In December 1833, Murray traveled to Philadelphia to attend the organizational meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society. It was a momentous occasion that would be celebrated 30 years later, and which Murray also attended. The next year, after facing continuous mob violence and organizing a half-dozen anti-slavery societies in Vermont, he organized the nation's first state anti-slavery society in Vermont. Mobbing of anti-slavery society lecturers was common. Henry B. Stanton, Elizabeth Cady's husband, one of the first lecturers commissioned by the American Anti-Slavery Society, wrote that he was mobbed 200 times. During the week of October 21st to October 25th, there were large violent mobs that threatened abolitionists in Montpelier, Vermont, Utica, New York, and Boston, where William Lloyd Garrison was dragged out of hiding and a rope attached to his neck before the mayor and police intervened. In 1835, Murray purchased the Vermont Telegraph, the official publication of the state's Baptist Church, with the help of Brandon resident John Conant, one of the wealthiest men in Vermont, and a leading member of the church. It was a 4-page tabloid published bi-weekly. His first issue was published on October 1st that year. The Conant stove, the source of Conant's fortune, was sold widely throughout the Northeast. The Murrays had a Conant stove and brought it from Vermont to Ohio. The resources for creating the stoves were rich reserves of iron ore in Vermont. One large discovery was made near Brandon, and this is a photo of the ruins of one of those blast furnaces from that time. When the Murray family moved to Brandon, they moved into the Baptist Church rectory before moving into this house in Brandon, which still stands. Among the news Murray published were reports from William Miller, who now had made a firm prediction that the Second Coming would occur in 1843. Murray was skeptical, but kept an open mind. While Murray published religious news and discussion of Scripture on the front page, his back pages were filled with coverage of anti-slavery, temperance, and other reforms. Anti-slavery had become his religion. He not only supported anti-slavery, but was active in the Underground Railroad. He published 3 lengthy accounts in the Telegraph, identifying his collaborators. Murray's coverage of reform topics was unpopular with some readers who wanted more focus on religion. Some even canceled their subscriptions. He also attacked clerics in the South who owned slaves and clerics in the North who continued fellowship with them, which this article references. Between 1839 and 1840, tragedy struck, not once, not twice, but 3 times within 9 months. His 6-year-old daughter, Harriet, drowned in the Neshobe River. His 4-year-old daughter, Catherine, died of the croup, and another unnamed person in his household died 3 months later. As you can see in this image, Murray's home straddled the river. Dissatisfaction with Murray's coverage grew, as well as with his attacks on clerics. Secretly, the leadership of the State Baptist Church decided to terminate their relationship with the Telegraph and start another newspaper, the Vermont Baptist Journal, to replace it. John Conant was among those individuals. Not long after, Murray was excommunicated from his family's church in Orwell. Note in this article, Garrison calls him wild and madcap. Meanwhile, the followers of William Miller had grown to more than 50,000, and he began traveling widely and holding revivals. Trumpeting Miller's message, a monthly newspaper published by Joshua Himes, The Signs of the Times, was begun in 1840, and a dozen or so ministers began holding their own Second Coming revivals in support of Miller. It was while holding large meetings in New York and Philadelphia that Miller predicted the date of the Second Coming could come as early as March 21st, 1843. By coincidence, a great comet flashed across the heavens on March 3rd, 1843. Miller decided it was time to return home to wait for the glorious day. But the Second Coming never came that month. So, Miller revised his prediction, saying it would occur sometime before the end of 1844. As time passed, Miller finally confessed that he must have made some sort of error, but said that he was confident Christ would be coming soon. Murray had by this time finally and totally repudiated Miller. Despite his failure, Miller's followers never gave up hope and founded a denomination that still exists today, the Seventh-day Adventists. Likewise, Murray had become disheartened and had lost many of his subscribers. Continually attacked in the Vermont press, he realized it was time to move on, to regenerate. Murray relocated his office for the Regenerator in Manhattan, which was a short ferry ride from Brooklyn, then a rural community where he moved his family. It was intended as a temporary home, as Murray looked for a permanent place to settle. He had become enthusiastic about the community movement, then in vogue, and connected with reformers in southern Ohio, Abram Brook and Valentine Nicholson, who had started one in West Liberty, Ohio, called Prairie Home. There he saw the potential for an Eden-like existence, where people could live in harmony and peace. Murray's family moved there while he settled things in New York. When he left New York, he followed the route they had taken, taking passage on the same Lake Erie steamer, the Robert Fulton, from Buffalo to Sandusky. That evening, after it left its port, he became seasick, so he went up on deck and fell asleep. About an hour later, he was shaken awake. The ship was tossing in the waves as a ghoulish gale gusted over and howled. Water splashed onto the deck and blew him across. The careening ship was riding up monstrous waves and down roller coaster chasms. They swooshed and continued to lash at him. He reached for a dangling rope attached to the deck and held tight. It felt like the boat would capsize at any moment. Passengers below deck were screaming and praying as he clung to the rope. Water continued to thrash about and began pouring into the cabin and below deck. Parts of the deck began falling away. Then he heard a crackling sound as the mainsail washed into the lake. The ship was at the mercies of the elements as Orson's body swung like a rag doll, his life literally hanging by a thread as he was pummeled by the ferocious waves. A month later, Murray arrived in Cincinnati, where he took the train, which stopped by the home of Henry Butterworth, who took him to the home of Valentine Nicholson in Harrisburg. Murray's family had since left Prairie Home, which had dissolved, and were staying with Dr. Brooke in Oakland. The next night, Nicholson took him to his family, and they came back with Nicholson to his home, where they remained for the next 4 months. On January 1st, 1845, Murray published his first issue of the Regenerator in Ohio, while staying in Harrisburg. On March 20th, 1845, the Murrays moved to Fruit Hills with 10 other adults and 2 other children, with expectations of more to join them. Their land sat across the river from the homestead and mill of retired Ohio Governor Jeremiah Morrow. The Little Miami Railroad ran along the edge of the property at the riverside, at that time extending another 10 miles upriver to Morrow. This is the first issue of the Regenerator published at Fruit Hills on April 14th, 1845. The paper was at first a 4-page tabloid, which expanded to a 16-page tabloid a year later. This is an illustration of the covered bridge at nearby Foster's Crossing that was built in 1837. This is a view from Foster's Crossings today. When the Murrays moved to Fruit Hills, they took out a mortgage on the property from William Butterworth, the brother of Henry Thomas Butterworth. Murray was hopeful that this would be the beginning of his socialist community that would support his reform newspaper. References in later Regenerators indicated that individuals continually joined and left the community during the next 2 years. Among those who I've identified as community members were Robert T. Thornburn, G.W. Rawlings, John Herford, Joel P. Davis, Pennick Pusey, Joseph Gregory, C.D. Lewis, David Thomas, and Robert Cheney. This is a picture of Pusey, the only member whose picture I have so far been able to find. Fruit Hills was along the route of the Underground Railroad. This is a miniature of the Liberator, which was built by Abram Allen in nearby Oakland, and which was alleged to have transported as many as 3,000 fugitive slaves to freedom. This miniature was a gift from Allen to his collaborator Valentine Nicholson, who, as we know, was a close friend of Murray. One of Murray's original community members, Joel P. Davis, also was very active in the Underground Railroad during the 1840s. This is the home of Henry T. Butterworth today. His wife was the sister of Nicholson's wife, and like his brother-in-law and his brother William, was very active in the Underground Railroad. In 1847, Murray was called to testify at a trial in nearby Lebanon, Ohio. Today, that courthouse is the office of the Warren County Job Services Department. Murray was subpoenaed by the noted politician Thomas Corwin, but when he refused to swear on the Bible, his testimony was rejected. He wrote extensively about it in The Regenerator. Murray was obsessed with health and followed the Sylvester Graham theory of good health. Its dietary rules included no coffee, tea, alcohol, or hot beverages, no tobacco, no salt, no food derived from animal products, moderate eating of vegetables, fruit, and unbolted bread, of which there is a full-length article in one issue of The Regenerator, and cold water bathing, which was prescribed by the water cure treatment. He occasionally discussed his own diet and said, at times, that his family returned to eating animal products, confessing that he liked the taste of beef. Carlos Orson Murray was Orson's oldest son and heir apparent. He began writing articles for The Regenerator around 1846 under the signature C.O.M. They were quite eloquent. He was very much in tune with nature. However, he was frail and in poor health. It caused him to go to New York for the water cure treatment under the care of Dr. Shue, the editor of the Water Cure Journal. 2 years later, after returning to New York for the water cure treatment with Dr. Shue, he died and was buried there. Murray wrote the following in a Regenerator extra he issued about Carlos. At this point, the little brother of the deceased, who is setting the type, tells me the space in the extra is about filled. The momentary feeling is that of discomfort at being arrested and limited by such a circumstance, but there is no proper way of avoiding it that I see now. I would have spoken briefly of other qualities, of his far-seeing and tracing causes and effects, of his living in advance of the existing generation, of his views of the diseased and disordered condition of the mass of human beings in their present ignorance and mistreatment of themselves, of his sympathy with all living things, of his freedom from bigotry, from the impositions of superstition, and from fears of the unknown. But I must speak of his dying and stop for the present. 4 months after Carlos's death, Robert Cheney, a Scottish immigrant who had been part of the original Fruit Hills community and who had moved to Cincinnati, returned to Fruit Hills to help the reeling Murray. The Regenerator, which had been a bi-weekly, thereafter became a monthly. There also was no August issue that year. Cheney moved back in September and stayed for about 7 months and wrote more than 20 articles. During that time, he took a trip to New York City and wrote this graphic story about a slaughterhouse. Murray would not let go of Carlos in every issue, mention of Carlos was made either by Orson or through letters written by subscribers. In fact, Murray would continue to write about him until 1856, when he stopped publishing. More dramatic, however, was the mention of Carlos by Regenerator readers who were attending spiritualist sessions. Spiritualism was a fad at the time, and it wasn't long before a medium was brought to Fruit Hills, likely by Nicholson, who was a firm believer, to the home of the Butterworths. Carlos was summoned and spoke on the first night to his father and on the second to his mother. Murray was skeptical, but still held on to hope that perhaps he would someday communicate with Carlos. Murray had problems with a family who had mortgaged part of Murray's land. His health declined, and he did not publish in October and November 1852. In the December 1852 issue, he discussed his illness in a tone that suggested he may be dying. From the symptoms he described, it sounded like he was battling malaria, which was common at that time in Ohio. He published only 8 issues of the Regenerator in 1853 and 3 in 1854, suspending publication until renaming it Murray's Review, a 4-page tabloid, which began in October 1854 and suspended in March 1856. At the Cincinnati Anti-Slavery Convention in 1855, he engaged in a heated debate with the celebrated abolitionist John Rankin over the question of whether the Bible sanctioned slavery. Though he had intended to resume Murray's Review, Murray instead focused on his farming partnership with 19-year-old son Charles. This was nothing new for Murray. He had farmed his entire life, and always when publishing the newspaper. Agriculture was a regular feature in the paper. There were articles on potatoes, peaches, strawberries, watermelon, raspberries, cherries, corn, plowing, fertilizer, manure, seeds, pears, and apples. The Murray specialty was sweet potatoes. His son Marcina developing a unique method of cultivating them, something for which he became famous when he later moved to Tennessee, earning the moniker Sweet Potato Murray. Death visited Murray's life again in 1860 when wife Catherine Maria died at the water cure facility in Yellow Springs. Later that year, Murray attended an infidel convention in New York City and announced that he was dying. Instead of dying, Murray absorbed himself in his writing, submitting articles to the Liberator again, and becoming a contributor to a new reformist publication, The New Republic. In 1861, he delivered a 68-page diatribe at the Pike Opera House in Cincinnati, criticizing the North for its leniency towards the secession of the Confederate States, especially Secretary of State William Seward. The next year, again at the Pike, he accompanied Wendell Phillips, who was mobbed and egged when he attempted to give a speech about the progress of the war. One of the eggs hit Murray. On October 16, 1862, he married Lydia P. Jacobs of Chester County, Pennsylvania. This marriage was short-lived, and there are no records of how they met or when it ended. It is likely that they met through Valentine Nicholson, who was acquainted with Jacob's cousin, Edwin Fussell. Her uncle, Dr. Bartholomew Fussell, was a member of the legendary Longwood Meeting in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, and a close collaborator in the Underground Railroad with Thomas Garrett. The next year, in December of 1863, Murray attended the 3 Decades meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia. It was a significant event, the celebration of the founding of the society, which led the fight to end slavery, and Murray was one of 13 of the original founders who attended. But it turned out to be a great disappointment, as he was snubbed by Garrison and others because of his infidelity. Murray retreated to Fruit Hills, and on October 2nd, 1865, he married for the third and last time to local girl, Ianthe Poor. He was 59, and she was 31. The marriage was a family affair because his youngest son, Ichabod, married Ianthe's younger sister, and his daughters, Rachel and Rosalinda, married Ianthe's brother, William Poor, and his business partner, Henry Kelly. Eventually, Murray's children gave him 19 grandchildren. While living at Fruit Hills in 1850, Robert Cheney wrote a poem which portrays the meaning that life had for Murray and those who lived there, entitled Heaven in This Life. This world is bright and beautiful, none else for us so fair. And were we true and dutiful, we'd seek no heaven elsewhere. When superstition's chains are riven and freedom we enjoy, then will no vain false hopes of heaven, nor fears of hell annoy. When to ourselves and others true, and true to nature's laws, joy and content will then ensue, as effect follows cause. Then jarring discord sound shall cease, and passion's deadly strife. Then will the world be filled with peace, and heaven be in this life. On June 14, 1885, Orson Smith Murray left this earth. His desire was to be cremated. There were no crematoria in Ohio, so his body had to be taken to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the site of the nation's first public crematorium. His family and friends gathered outside his home for the funeral. There were the Butterworths and Valentine Nicholson, and officials from the Cremation Society. A German lawyer read Murray's eulogy, which he himself had written, calling it Deathbed Thoughts. This is the concluding excerpt. The philosophy which assures me of rest and peace includes the thought, the full abiding conviction in the perpetual motion and universal change of all things, that in the relation of things this is inevitable, that in these processes all forms have their beginnings, their periods, terms, and terminations of existence, that no form is or can be the same thing 2 moments of time during its existence, and never again the same existence, that this pertains to all forms, whatever have been, are, or can be. Murray's ashes were spread at his wife's tombstone in Union Cemetery in Loveland, Ohio. Orson Murray sought a higher law, a law not dictated by a higher power. If it begins with making the God the supreme lawgiver, he wrote, it leaves off making man's conscience the supreme and final arbiter. His conscience, his rational powers, his search for the best ways of human living, this was his higher law. Gods, governments, rules that required absolute obedience had no place in his life. He was a questioner, a gadfly, a troublemaker who disturbed the peace and comfort of established ways and accepted truths. For Murray, there was no such thing as an accepted truth. There was always finding a better way, an even higher law.